Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Heather Tick, and I'm here today to talk to you about different kinds of strategies that we can use to help people deal with chronic pain. I've been a pain doctor for over 25 years, and I've spent my career looking for ways in which we can help the normal function of people to be more adaptive in order to help them deal with things like chronic pain. So one of the things we know is that if you have no brain, you have no pain, because 100% of the time, pain is experienced through the brain. So it's as though everything goes through this CPU, this computer that processes the experience, modifies it along the way, and it gives us what is the sum total of our pain experience. What that means, though, is that also offers us ways in which we can alter and help people change the way in which their brain is perceiving their pain. And those are some of the most exciting things that are happening right now in the pain field. Because we all know we've had some trouble with conventional pain care and the way in which it has caused a lot of harm and damage. So let's start with acute pain. Acute pain is usually thought of as short-term pain, but it isn't necessarily. It's really more about mechanism in terms of what is causing the pain and can we determine what's causing the pain rather than just the timeline. So you can have things that are causing you acute pain and you can have them last for a long time. And so it may be that it lasts for more than the 3-month or 6-month cutoff that commonly gets used when we talk about acute versus chronic pain, but it may still be the mechanisms of acute pain. And those are generally mechanisms that where we can identify what it is that caused it. You have a broken leg, you have a burnt hand, you have some physical thing that has happened to you that we can attach the experience of pain to. That's usually what we call acute pain. Once it becomes chronic pain, then the attachment, the connection of the pain, of what the person is experiencing, to what caused it, the tissue damage that might be causing it, is more tenuous. And we have then many mechanisms that have changed within the body or the brain or the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. And we'll talk about many of those. Those mechanisms have changed, and that's really what we talk about when we talk about the chronification of pain. So pain was initially designed as a call to action. It's supposed to alert you to danger. It's supposed to keep you from ongoing damage or even death. Because if you can imagine the early days of beings, of humans, of animals, we needed to get our foot out of the fire. We needed to not run on a broken limb because it could kill us if we didn't stop and take care of ourselves. So pain in that regard is a survival mechanism. And as with most of our drive system, there's an emotional component to it as well. So pain is not just a sensation. Now, there are many different communication systems that allow nerve cells to communicate with each other and with the rest of the body. One of those systems is electrical. This is when neurons or nerve cells fire. They release an electrical signal called an action potential. The action potential travels along the axons, which are these long projections that come out from the nerve, and then that connects that nerve signal with other nerves or with other cell types in the body and causes things to happen. Then there are chemical communication systems. So there are neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters depend on close proximity. The cell bodies have to be close to each other in order for them to be able to communicate with each other or with other tissues. Those signals can either inhibit or they can stimulate reaction. Now, when I went to medical school, there were 4 neurotransmitters recognized. Now we have many, many, many times more than that. and it's become a much more interesting field. And next, there are certain chemical messengers, and these ones act like a lock and key. They can be peptides or hormones or growth factors, and they can change behavior and mood. They act through these receptors that are like the lock part, and then the molecule, the messenger molecule, is like the key. And then behind all this, we have a background operating system that has only recently become discovered. And the first one we recognized was oxytocin, oxytocin being the hormone of attachment. And we recognize that oxytocin gets released under certain circumstances, when mothers are feeding babies, when people are intimate with each other, when groups of people get together and bond and share experiences. That's an oxytocin experience. Even a good long hug will release oxytocin, and it helps those people bond. But then there have been new discoveries about the background opioid system that is in the background, and it is also responsible for many human behaviors. And the oxytocin system may be attached, may be associated with bonding in most animals. But once you get higher up into primates, and specifically into humans with a very large frontal cortex, the opioids become more important. And this is some of what causes some of the very abnormal behavior that we see in people who are on chronic opioids, who have this failure of connection, parents who neglect their children, and other such behaviors that don't seem humanly normal. So when you look at the whole system of chronic pain, it's not that original picture that you saw back at the beginning of this slideshow, where there was the foot on the fire and the single neuron that went up to the brain caused a stimulation and then went down as a reflex. It becomes extraordinarily complex with many stops and starts and different pathways. This is the Tokyo subway station, by the way. So one of the complicating factors that happens are things called inhibitory pathways. So usually we think of a pathway in the brain as something stimulates you, something touches your hand, it goes up into the brain, it causes a reaction, and or a perception anyway, and that's a pathway that is causing an action. But then we have these other pathways that inhibit, and we're learning more and more about those all the time. We keep discovering new ways in which the system is designed to inhibit itself. So let's just pause for a second and think, well, why would we want to have inhibition in the pain system? Well, you remember the analogy I gave you at the beginning of you're running on a broken leg or your hand is in the fire, and if you don't stop that activity right away, you might die. So what happens if you are running after a gazelle and you have to kill that gazelle in order for your village to be able to eat, but you sprain your ankle? You don't break it, but you sprain it. You know you're hungry, you know your family is hungry, and you need to keep going. And you don't have time to stop and nurse your sprained ankle. And your brain quickly makes a calculation, even without your consciousness, and says, hey, look, this one's not going to kill us, so just keep running, get that gazelle, because hunger is going to kill us faster than this sprained ankle. And so the hunter in that case keeps going and completes his mission, and the village is happy, and he then has to sit home and nurse a sprained ankle for a while. So the brain made an executive decision to inhibit the pain that was coming from that ankle, so the hunter didn't even realize it was there. This happens in war, this happens in football games too. And so what we've got here is some of the pathways that happen and some of the chemicals that get released that work on some of these inhibitory pathways. So now we have this red arrow going up, and that's the pain signal, and that gives you pain, kind of medium-sized pain. And then the middle diagram is you've got the red arrow going up saying pain, you've got the blue arrow going down saying inhibit pain, and so you've got a little experience of pain. Well, then we have something else that's possible too. We have the red arrow going up for pain, the blue arrow coming down to inhibit pain, and then we have something that may inhibit the inhibition, and then you get even more pain. And some people call that central sensitization, or peripheral sensitization, or just sensitization. And so that is when people become extremely hypersensitive to even light touch. Everything hurts them. And so this is an increased response relative to the stimulus. There are some people who, even when you brush by them lightly, are going to experience that as excruciating pain. Some people find their clothes painful. And this is another alteration that happens within the nervous system that we're starting to learn more and more about. And it can happen in the peripheral nervous system, where it is the events, the changes in the periphery in the body that actually make the body more sensitive. And there are other ones where it is the central nervous system, the spine and the brain that make those changes. And sometimes there's an overlap of both. Usually there are both involved, is what most of the researchers say. Now, microglia are little cells that are in the central nervous system. They're in our spinal cord and in our brain. We used to think of them as, when I went to school, they were packaging material, is what we thought. They were there to keep the nerve cells, the important nerve cells, from rattling around in the empty spaces between each other, and to keep them safe. Over time, we learned that the microglia is the immune system in the central nervous system, and that it also is there to, these microglia are there to repair the neurons. And then we realized they not only repair the neurons, they also damage the neurons, and in that way they can be one of the causes of central sensitization. So what are some of the reasons that turn the microglia from protectors into damagers? Well, it can happen more with emotional trauma or stress. Current stress, past trauma, past abuse are things that can cause the microglia to become activated, and when they become activated, they do damage. It also happens with opioid use. Now, think about this. Here we have opioids that are supposed to treat pain and give people relief. And in fact, they're one of the causes of central sensitization that makes people feel even more sensitive to pain. It's a completely unfair situation, but that, however, is what goes on. Now, some questions still exist about this. So for some people, the sensitization can take place very early on in their course. It can take place at very low doses. It doesn't have to be high doses. For other people, it's a long time and a high dose. But how do you know who is the patient sitting in front of you? Are they going to turn into someone who gets centrally sensitized after the first or the second or the third dose? Are they going to be the one who can safely take the drugs for a long period of time? We have no way of knowing right now. And also tissue damage can cause peripheral sensitization, and the peripheral sensitization can in turn cause central sensitization. And then, of course, there's just regular inflammation. Inflammation is a process where there are chemicals within the body that are damaging to tissues. We've all heard of free radicals, and there are other sorts of inflammation as well, where the the damaging molecules in the system that need to be neutralized by usually nutritional substances. That's where most of the healing capacity is from the body, within the body. And so some of the things, some of the antioxidants, which are the major component of things that quench the inflammation in the body. Some of them are produced by our body as well. So coenzyme Q10 is a major one that we can produce. Melatonin is another major one that we can produce. But the balance of inflammation is very important in determining whether central sensitization happens. And as I've already hinted, diet has a lot to do with that. So let's talk about the endogenous opioid system. That means the opioids that are within our own system, that run our system. So they're part of a punishment system, because if you are deficient in opioids, you have pain. And pain is viewed in, if you look at the literature, it's very closely tied with punishment throughout the literature written about pain. Not the medical literature particularly, but if you look at ancient literatures and if you look at primitive societies, they talk about pain as punishment. There's also a role for a reward system, and it also is responsible for socialization. So pain and punishment are derived from the same Latin word. Opium, which comes from the poppies, it's the raw material from poppies, it was seen as divine benevolence in terms of relieving suffering. Candace Pert and Snyder, they were the two people who identified opioid receptors in the brain as part of the pain system. And that was a major breakthrough in our understanding of receptors in the brain. But pain and pain relief is not just a simple cause and effect of having pain and then adding some opium, stimulating opioid receptors, and then simply you have relief and no other consequences, because you still have the whole rest of the system. You have punishment, you have reward, you have socialization, and it's all mixed up together. So the reward system is primarily run by dopamine. And there's a lot of very complex parts of the brain that are involved here. There's the mesocorticolimbic dopamine systems. They start in the ventral tegmental area. They project into the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. Addiction acts through dopamine circuits in this center. They produce reward and they reinforce addiction. And the endogenous opioid system is involved there. We used to think it was all just dopamine and that you could be quite independent from the reward system with just opioids, and that therefore we used to say in the bad old days that if you were in pain you couldn't get addicted, and we were wrong. So it turns out that opioids trigger this dopamine system. They also trigger the descending inhibitory system. And dopamine plays a role in motivation to tolerate pain. So we are also wired to tolerate pain for certain reasons. So one of the reasons I mentioned to you was running after food, getting food, sex, social status. Those are all things that are very, very highly motivated within our brain, and our brain will override the opioid system and go for the dopamine system and create reward in order for us to achieve those things. And then socialization, and this is extremely important because opioids reduce the affective or emotional aspects of pain. So they numb you in a way to the emotion. And they do this at lower doses than they affect the sensory or painful component. And this has the opportunity for pain to really mess with our brain and our relationships. And this is often described by both patients who have pain and are being treated as a result of that with opioids, and by people who become addicted to opioids for whatever reason, whether it's through pain medication or through other illegal sources of opioids. Their families will tell you that their personalities change. And in our clinic, we have, for the last 8 years, been reducing people off of opioids as we've recognized the dangers, the risks, and the lack of effectiveness of opioids. And what we found is that people come back to us. We go through slow tapering regimens, and they come back to us and they say, when they're at either low doses or at no doses many times, that yes, they still feel pain, but it may be, and I'd say probably at least 30 to 40% of the time, they feel less pain than they felt when they were on opioids, or they feel the same amount as the rest of them. So about 30 to 40% feel less pain. The rest of them don't feel more pain. They feel about the same pain they did when they were on opioids. But they say they feel their personality is back, that they have motivation to do things, to get involved in life, and their families comment very, very often that they have their family member back, and they're very grateful that the doses are now lower because of that. I have to say we were very surprised when that started happening. We knew we needed to reduce people in doses because of the risk of death, but to find that we were actually having a positive impact on their pain and the rest of their life was really quite stunning. So chronic pain is not just a sensory problem. It's also a punishment and reward problem. It's also an emotional as well as a sensory problem. Now, just in case you don't know, inadvertent opioid prescription overdoses, they happen almost 3 times every hour in the US. They're being used to treat psychiatric comorbidities much of the time. So sometimes people self-medicate. They gravitate more towards opioids if they have psychiatric distress, because it does calm them. It does take care of that emotional side. It's not the best way to do it because it's suppressing it. It's not actually dealing with it and learning coping strategies and resilience. But it does lead to people who are more prone to psychiatric illness to become more likely to gravitate towards high-dose long-term opioids. And opioids do disrupt the reward system, but also hormones and attachment. So sexual difficulties happen very often on opioids. So what are some of the solutions that we can use to help people with this? Well, we can encourage them to move, because we know that movement builds strength and flexibility. It increases endogenous opioids, so it builds your own system of opioids. You also get increased serotonin, so exercise improves mood. And sometimes you get increased pain, but it's usually in the short term, and usually if you can overcome that, the pain may be the same or reduced in the long run. Movement also rewires the somatosensory cortex. So when you have chronic pain, you change the way in which your body moves. Your brain realizes, don't use your arm that way because it hurts, so it starts using another set of muscles. And those muscles get trained into the brain, so that when you start to try and use them, you keep going back to that altered pattern, which is maladaptive. What that causes is exercise intolerance often, and you actually have to have strategies to retrain the brain. And there are systems of movement that are able to do that. Shirley Sarman was one of the first physical therapists. She was head of physical therapy at Wash U in St. Louis, and she had a system of training physical therapists to be able to do that, retrain the brain. She got started in her work with post-polio and stroke patients. Acupuncture. There's good evidence that acupuncture reverses changes in the somatosensory cortex, which is where movement initiation starts, and some of that research was done by Vitaly Napido at Harvard. Hélène Langevin from also Harvard and from University of Vermont has done a lot of research on fascia and the immune function of fascia and what stretching can do to fascia. So it's also quite interesting in terms of modifying pain. She was part of a group that was able to do a study looking at a specialized kind of ultrasound of people with back pain. It's called elastography. And with elastography, you get an increased density that you can see as a thickening and a lack of movement in the layers of fascia. And they were able to tell the difference between patients who had back pain and patients who didn't, based on that testing. So it turns out that fascia is becoming much more widely understood and studied. It is much more of a connector of everything within the body, and things that we didn't used to think could be connected, we now know are connected, and it's through fascia. And fascia is as though it is a body-wide energy transduction system. And again, lots more to learn about it. We really are just at the tip of the iceberg. Something very interesting connected with movement, Kathleen Sluka has done some really good research showing that TENS devices actually work better when you use them when you're moving. So a lot of people will put on their TENS device and they'll lie down and rest. That's not getting the best impact out of TENS. So move around with it. It will increase your ability to move. So you'll get decreased pain and increased ability to move. That's a twofer. Now, we talked about inflammation. So this is not several servings of vegetables that you're seeing here. Ketchup and French fries are not considered two vegetables, and even the little bit of lettuce and this one slice of tomato there, maybe I'll grudgingly call that vegetables. This meal causes inflammation, and it causes inflammation, not this one. This one causes inflammation for 8 hours after you eat it. Body-wide inflammation. Now, this meal doesn't cause inflammation. This one is an anti-inflammatory diet or a Mediterranean diet. There's lots of vegetables, fruit, yummy things. There's wine, there's nuts, there's seeds, there's chocolate. There has to be chocolate everywhere if I'm setting the table. And yes, there is some fish and some meat in there somewhere, but it's a small amount. You have to look hard for it. And that's the way it should be. Most nutrition comes from the plant portion of what we eat. So when we talk about inflammation in the gut, and that gets mediated through the microbiome. That is the mass of bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms in and around our body. The vast majority of that microbiome is in our gut. There are 10 times as many cells in the microbiome as we have human cells in us, 200 times more DNA. That means we are more them than us. And the microbiome controls inflammation by controlling what gets through our bowel wall and controlling the health of our bowel wall. Just on the other side of the bowel wall is 80% of our immune system. Now, 80% of our serotonin also gets produced in the gut. And so now we are recognizing that food and mood are very, very intimately connected. Behavior and mood are connected. Now, anybody who's raised kids realizes that if you sit them down to a sugar meal with lots of additives and artificial colorings, that you'll have kids that bounce off the wall. But we don't realize that that also happens to us throughout our lives. What we eat really does determine how we feel. There are enough nerve cells in the gut for a small mammal's brain. So for every complex problem, there is an answer that is simple, neat, and wrong. And for so long, this has been our answer. We've been turning to drugs where In fact, what we eat, drink, think, feel, and do is a much better solution to how to deal with chronic pain. So, the key to life and pain relief: eat real food, move, deal with your stress, get enough sleep, laugh, love, play, and find meaning. Those are the things that are important to people. Those are the things that even when they're still in pain, they can start to deal with and they can start to recover their lives with. So it's not enough to say, I'm sorry, I can't cook properly, I can't walk, I can't exercise, I can't make myself sleep, I can't have fun because I have pain. Because the actual opposite is the truth, that it is those things that are going to relieve your pain, going to distract you from your pain and give you back your life. It may not be easy, but it is the best way to try and overcome this. And it's because of the tremendous complexity of our central nervous system, of our peripheral nervous system, and the impact of all these different neurotransmitters and the underlying endogenous opioid system that runs so many of our normal functions. So the real voyage in life is a discovery that consists not in seeing new landscapes necessarily, but in seeing the same things with new eyes. And that's what it's time to do right now, is to look at the whole problem of pain as not a drug deficiency syndrome, but maybe a life deficiency syndrome, and get people back into their lives and then help them at the same time deal with pain. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you. Take care.